Hello and welcome back, it's Abaddon Sentinel here again, and today I'm bringing you the second part in my tutorials on how to paint Abaddon the Despoiler. Now this part focuses on his cloak. Cloaks can be quite difficult to paint to get the smooth transitions in all the different folds that you get on them, but hopefully with these basic techniques you'll be painting cloaks in no time. Let's get on with it. So here we have the cloak primed with Chaos Black. First of all we're going to use Mechanicus Standard Grey. We just want to thin this down a little bit, and we're going to slap this all over the fur at the top of the cloak. The rest of the cloak will be based with red, so we're not needing to put anything on that, but that does mean that you can be a little bit rough with this as you're putting it on. It doesn't need to be perfect, because we're going to be going over the other bits afterwards. Next up we have the Nuln oil. Now this is just going to be on the fur again, just to give it a bit of a recess shade in between all those little tufts that it's got modelled on there. Now this will give you obviously the shadows that you need underneath, as well as giving a bit of contrast before we go on to the next step and start highlighting the tips of those tufts. Nuln oil is great for this one just because obviously we're working in more of a grey scale, so you want a black wash as opposed to any kind of coloured wash to go over these. Next up we're going to be using Karak stone. This one we're using as a dry brush. If you're not sure how to dry brush, basically you get your brush, get a little bit of paint on the end, and you just basically wipe a lot of the actual paint off on some kitchen rolls, some tissue paper, whatever. So you've just got a very small amount left on the brush, and then as you can see, you just drag it backwards and forwards across the edges of whatever it is that you're painting, and it picks up bits of the pigment, and you can slowly build it up to get some colour on there. Finally, we're going to be using some Longbeard grey. Longbeard grey is an actual dry brush paint specifically designed for this purpose. Basically it's quite a thick paint and it's not very liquidy. It makes it very easy to get that pigment worked into the bristles, but without making it run too quickly onto your actual model. Now I've turned the cloak upside down here to make it easier to drag the brush downwards and just catch the tips of this. That's because this is supposed to be just the most extreme highlight on the edges of the fur here. You don't want too much on, because it'll make the fur look a bit too light. It just wants to be on the very tips. After painting the fur, we're going to move on to the rest of the cloak. So we're going to use Khorne red as the base coat, thinned with a little bit of water again. Maybe do 2 thin coats just to make sure you get a nice smooth coverage. Be careful next to the fur obviously, as that bit's already finished. We don't want to be contaminating that with any of the red. You can fix it afterwards, which I do have to do at one point, but obviously it's easy to avoid it if possible. After this we're going to be using some Nuln oil. Now this we're going to put all over the Khorne red to let it settle in the recesses. Now I hold the cloak upside down for this, just to make sure that the shadows actually settle in more realistic places. A lot of the time if you put shade onto a cloak, it will settle on top of folds, which is actually where it should be the lightest, because that's where it captures the light. So just make sure that it doesn't pull too much, and hold the cloak upside down, and it'll get around this issue to a certain extent, not entirely. And we want to make sure we put this all over the Khorne red so that we don't get any odd edges where the shade has stopped, and it gives us a nice even finish-ish to then start layering over the top of with the next step. You can see that I'm using the brush to spread that Nuln oil around and reabsorb it from any areas where it's pooling a little bit too much. Make sure that it's in the places that I want it to be in, rather than just letting it settle where it feels like all over the miniature. Now that the Nuln oil has dried, you can see that it's shaded those recesses for us nicely. It's a little bit blotchy on the smooth sections, but that's not going to matter after this next part. For that we're going to be using some Wazdakka red mixed equally with Lahmian medium, thinned with a tiny bit of water, just to build up some extra highlights on there now. Now the reason that we mix Lahmian medium in with this, rather than just using water, is Lahmian medium actually manages to thin the paint down and make it more translucent without actually altering the consistency of it. We then use the little bit of water as normal, because that allows it to give that smooth finish that we're used to, and that, the reason why we use water with the other colours. You can see that I'm using the edge of my brush, and this allows me to control where I'm applying the paint a lot better. Rather than accidentally getting it on some of the flatter surfaces, I'm getting it just on that very corner that I want to put it on. Now this next section is a little bit difficult just because of how small it is. You can use the tip of your brush, but you've got to make sure that you put the paint on little by little just so that you don't overwhelm it and ruin the paint job basically. The Nuln oil is obviously settled a lot in that little recess, so you don't want to completely cover that up, and you've got to try and build a transition between the bright Wazdakka red and that Khorne red covered in Nuln oil. You can see that I'm just doing little brush strokes there, repeatedly over and over again, just slowly building the colour up. After this, I'm just going to show you how I start applying it to the smoother areas of the cloak. I've mixed up a little bit more there, just because I want to make sure I've got plenty to work with here. Once you start doing this, you want to try and keep going until you've got it just about where you want it, and then let that layer dry. Now you can see I'm slowly drawing that down, starting from one of the smoother folds, and bringing that pigment down towards the base of the cloak where it would be a little bit brighter. Now you can see the pigment itself actually moving around in that solution there, and I'm just using the brush to put that exactly where I want it. And you keep checking it just to make sure. The reason that I hold the cloak at the angle that I do is because I'm making sure to see where the light would actually be catching it. It's very easy to put the shades and the highlights in the wrong places on cloaks, so if you keep looking at it from the top, you'll see where the light should catch. Now you can see here what I'm doing. I've skipped forwards a little bit just so that I can show you how I've built the colour up, slowly bringing it further and further towards the tips where it will be brighter. Starting to draw some of the other folds that are on the cloak into the transition, just slowly bringing it down. And it's all about patience with this kind of technique. You just got to slowly build things up layer by layer, putting the pigment slowly further and further towards where you want it to be brightest. You can see me slowly working it down there, still bringing it further and further towards the bottom. It's generally always a good idea to draw towards where you want the brightness to be, not away from it, because you'll end up leaving a puddle of like thicker pigment where you actually want it to be darker. Here I will add that it's a lot of personal preference this. There's no 100% correct way of doing this, no 100% correct finish. It's about your personal preference with building up the highlights and the transitions between the colours. If you're entering competitions, obviously you'll want to try and reach a certain level of contrast. You can look at a lot of other competition entries to get some ideas, but it's still your own personal preference. As you can see, I'm quite happy with the tip there, and I'm ready to move on to the next stage. So with the other areas nicely transitioned, I'm moving on to TuskgorFur and Lahmian medium. This is going to be the most extreme highlight on the cloak. I'm using the same kind of mix. It's 1 part TuskgorFur, 1 part Lahmian medium, mixed with a little bit of water to thin the consistency down a touch. And I'm going to be using this mostly on just the most extreme highlights on the cloak. And you can see I'm just getting a nice tip on the brush there, because I'm going to be using the edge of that again to start doing the top crease. Now you can see I'm being fairly careful, because I just don't want to block out all of the Wazdakka red, but I just want to add that TuskgorFur as an extreme highlight on there. I'm going to run that almost all the way around the edge of the cloak as well, just skipping a couple of little tears, just so that we get that nice impression. We don't want it to look too clean around the edge, it is supposed to look ragged. Just leaving a couple of little gaps helps to give that impression. I'll also be using this to highlight the bottom edges of the holes in the main body of the cloak as well. With that done, I'm going to use the same colour, just add an extra highlight on the tips of those folds, just towards the top of the cloak. Now I'm using nowhere near as much as I did with the Wazdakka red. This is only going to be the very top's most extreme highlight. You just want to use the same technique as you were using with the Wazdakka red. Use it little by little, just add in a bit more pigment each time, building the highlight up until you're happy with the outcome. With the main body of the cloak finished, I'm now going to be using Rhinox hide. This is for the skin flap at the top of the fur. Now, Rhinox hide might be an odd colour for painting skin, but it actually works as a very good base underneath other skin colours, just because it helps add that tone to it. And it also means, if you do happen to mess anything up in the later stages, this looks very good as just a shadow on those skin tones. So it's actually a very good colour to use alongside them. Just make sure you get a nice smooth finish all over that skin flap before we move on to the next part. Next we're going to be using Rakarth flesh. Now this is going to be applied pretty much the same way as the Rhinox hide was. We want it thinned down a tiny bit, and we're going to be putting it all over that skin flap. You don't need to be quite as meticulous in working it down on the sides of the skin flap towards the fur. That was the main point of putting the Rhinox hide down, is that will help apply the blend of the skin into the fur areas. Now you can just see it's quite thin, so it's one of those usual Duncan quotes, too thin coats. With that finished, we're just going to give it an all over wash of Agrax Earthshade on that skin part. Again, you don't have to be too meticulous, you don't have to try and get it all the way down into the cracks next to the fur. Again, that's why the Rhinox hides there, it just makes a nicer transition. Obviously it's only a small area, so you just got to be careful not to let it pool too much. We just want a thin layer of it just to add in that little bit of extra texture to the area. Don't worry if you get it on the fur, you can always carefully dry brush that to correct it again afterwards and it won't look bad. So here I'm just doing a kind of a time lapse just to show you the Agrax Earthshade drying. The reason I'm doing this is because I know a lot of people worry about putting too much on or not enough on, and you can see through this, just as it dries, how much it does fade a little bit and you know, lose a lot of the shine and things like that. Just to give you an idea of, you know, how much you can actually put on. I'm going to go back to Rakarth flesh again after this. I'm going to be dry brushing this onto the skin now. The reason we're going to be doing this is just because it adds a little bit of extra highlighting and contrast between the Rakarth flesh areas and the Agrax Earthshade shaded areas. And it's not a massive highlight, it just adds a nice subtle touch to bring a little bit of contrast into the area because it's only small. With the dry brushing done, it's time to move on to Kislev flesh. Now the Kislev flesh is going to be used as an edge highlight around that skin area. It's just going to be thinned down with a little bit of water and put onto those corners where the skin should be the brightest, maybe where it's a little bit tattered and worn. Because I'm assuming, with this being Abaddon, this cloak's probably been on him for quite a long time now. So it's just going to make it look like the skin's been a bit stretched, it's a bit tattered now, it's, you know, it's not new skin basically. I'm also going to apply this just to those top little bumps. You don't have to go overboard with this. It's just a personal preference kind of thing. Just put an extra little bit of brightness on there, give some extra contrast, give a bit of texture to that skin. Remember that old battered skin is probably going to have quite a bit of texture to it. New skin, when it's stretched thin, is probably going to be still fairly smooth. But the old stuff is going to have gone very leathery, especially when, you know, it's supposed to be animal attached to this fur. Now the final detail is going to be base painted with Balthasar gold. This is the 3 different spikes that are holding the cloak and fur onto Abaddon's armour itself. You don't need a lot of this because obviously the spikes are only small. You just thin it down with a little bit of water and put 1 or 2 thin coats on just until you're happy with it. The reason that you want to be careful thinning this down, by the way, is any metallics, if you thin them down too much with water, you'll notice they begin to separate and the metallic flakes basically spread so far apart you can notice the individual flakes and it doesn't look very nice. After that, we just use Agrax Earthshade on the spikes. Now they are very small details, so you'll just want to be careful with this. Don't want to put too much on because it'll flood and obviously get onto the fur, which is not ideal, it's not what we're wanting. Just be very careful and make sure that you've got a thin layer of it on those spikes. The second to last step for these spikes is to use Gehenna's gold. Now we're going to thin this down with a little bit of water as well, and we're going to layer this mostly on top of the spikes and towards the tip, a little bit underneath as well, but like I say, mostly on the top and towards the tip. This will help give that nice sharp kind of impression that we're wanting from these spikes. Obviously if you want a bit more of a Nurgle inspired Abaddon, then you might want them to look a bit more blunt and rusty, but for the version that I'm going for, they want to be nice, sharp and clean, so the Gehenna's gold gives us a nice gold for that. The final step now is to apply a tiny dot of Runefang steel to the tip of those spikes. It is going to be thinned down again ever so slightly. The reason for it this time, while we're not trying to layer over the top quite so much, it's more just creating the little dot. If we were to leave the paint neat out of the pot, it would most likely come off in a fairly thick glob, which would, you know, ruin the end of the spikes for you, which is not what you want at this stage of a paint job. So doing that, you can just create a tiny little dot just to finish off that sharp spiky look on those spikes. So here is the finished cloak, and you'll notice as I pick it up that the inside isn't layered anywhere near as much as the outside was. So you don't have to do as much there because it is shadowed by Abaddon. It's not supposed to be quite as bright, but it works well enough just like that. Now turning it back round to see the main item there, I think I've done fairly well on that. It's not perfect. I probably could have made a little bit more of the contrast between the shades and then going up to some more extreme highlights, adding a bit of weathering to the, improve the tattered effect. But for a basic paint job using simple techniques, I think that will work very well for a centerpiece for your tabletop standard army. Now, if you're wanting to do competition level stuff, you would definitely want to do some more transitions there. But you'd need some more advanced techniques for that, and I just wanted to show some simple techniques for doing a fairly effective cloak, so I hope you liked it. Thank you for watching my tutorial on how to paint Abaddon the Despoiler's cloak. I hope you found that informative and enjoyed watching it. Remember to like the video if you did, comment down below with your own thoughts, and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more in the future, including part 3. See you later.